The January morning was so cold that ice had formed on the interior walls of every cabin in the settlement, except one. Inside Lars Kendrick's home, a 5-year-old visitor walked barefoot across wooden floors that radiated warmth like summer stones, while outside the temperature held at 19 degrees below zero. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The cabin sat in a small clearing 3 miles west of what would eventually become Helena, Montana, though in January of 1839 the area had no name beyond what the Blackfeet called it. Lars Kendrick had built the structure 2 years earlier when he married Ingrid Sorensen, a Norwegian immigrant's daughter he had met at a trading post near the Missouri River. The cabin was typical of the period, logs chinked with mud and moss, a single door facing south, one window, covered with oiled paper, and a stone fireplace that Lars had built with meticulous care over the course of 3 weeks. Inside, the morning routine followed patterns established over 2 winters of marriage. Lars woke before dawn, added wood to the fire that had burned low during the night, and waited for the flames to build before moving far from the fireplace's immediate warmth. Ingrid would wake soon after, wrap herself in a heavy woolen blanket, and move quickly from their bed to the area near the fire, where morning tasks could be accomplished without the bone-deep cold that pervaded the rest of the cabin. Their daughter Marta, 5 years old, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's serious disposition, slept on a pallet of furs positioned as close to the fireplace as safety allowed. This was not preference, but necessity. The cabin's dirt floor, separated from the frozen earth beneath by nothing more than packed clay, remained bitterly cold from October through April. Even with a fire burning constantly, the floor temperature never rose above 40 degrees during deep winter. Walking barefoot across it for even a few seconds caused sharp pain. Prolonged contact could lead to frostbite. Lars had accepted this reality as unchangeable. Every cabin he had ever seen in the mountains suffered the same problem. Heat rose. That was simply how fire worked. You kept the fire burning, you stayed near it when possible, and you wore heavy boots even inside your own home during winter months. The floor stayed cold. That was the cost of living in Montana Territory. On this particular January morning, nothing seemed unusual. The fire built steadily. Ingrid rose and wrapped herself against the cold. Marta stirred on her pallet, comfortable in the warmth radiating from the stone fireplace. Lars pulled on his boots, heavy wool socks underneath, and prepared to step out into the pre-dawn darkness to check on their 2 horses, sheltered in a small lean-to attached to the cabin's north wall. The temperature outside was 12 degrees below zero. Inside, near the fireplace, the air temperature held around 55 degrees, comfortable enough for someone wearing wool clothing and sitting still. 10 feet from the fireplace, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees. Near the walls, it approached freezing. The floor remained uniformly cold throughout, leaching heat from anyone who touched it, turning the earth beneath the cabin into an enormous heat sink that no amount of firewood could overcome. Lars had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, this accepted reality would destroy his family and set him on a path toward an innovation that would seem like madness to everyone who witnessed it. The cold snap arrived on January 14th with the sudden brutality characteristic of Montana winters. Lars had seen the signs that afternoon. High clouds moving fast from the northwest, the particular quality of light that suggested extreme cold coming. The way the horses moved restlessly in their shelter. He spent the late afternoon gathering extra firewood, stacking it inside the cabin near the fireplace, where it would stay dry and accessible. By sunset, the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero. By midnight, it had reached 35 below. Lars woke twice during the night to add wood to the fire, maintaining flames that seemed inadequate against the cold pressing in from all sides. The cabin's log walls, typically sufficient insulation, felt thin as paper against cold of this magnitude. Frost formed on the interior surfaces of the logs between the fireplace and the door. The oiled paper covering the window crackled with ice. Ingrid woke shivering around 3 in the morning. She had been sleeping in their bed positioned against the cabin's west wall, the farthest point from the fireplace. Lars heard her teeth chattering and immediately added more wood to the fire. He brought her a second blanket from their small supply. She wrapped it around herself but continued shivering. Marta, sleeping on her pallet near the fireplace, remained comfortable. The child had the warmth of the flames and the radiant heat from the stone fireplace mass. But Ingrid, 15 feet away, might as well have been sleeping outside. The cold rising from the floor beneath their bed was relentless. The bed frame raised the sleeping surface 18 inches above the ground, but that distance meant nothing. Cold air pooled at floor level, and the frozen earth beneath transmitted its temperature upward through the packed clay floor, through the bed frame, through the straw mattress. Lars moved their bed closer to the fireplace, dragging it across the floor, while Ingrid sat wrapped in blankets. The effort helped marginally. Positioned 8 feet from the fire instead of 15, Ingrid stopped shivering violently, but she did not warm. Her feet, which had been touching the bed's footboard, and thus in direct contact with wood that had been resting against the frigid floor, remained painfully cold. By morning, Ingrid had developed a cough. By midday, the cough had worsened, and she complained of pain in her chest. Lars kept the fire roaring, burning through wood at twice the normal rate. The cabin's interior temperature near the fireplace reached 60 degrees, almost comfortable. But Ingrid's condition deteriorated. The nearest doctor was in Fort Benton, 40 miles north. The journey in weather this extreme would take 2 days each direction, assuming the horses survived. Lars made the decision to ride for help on the second day when Ingrid's breathing became labored and her lips took on a bluish tint. He never made it to Fort Benton. The cold killed one horse 6 miles from the cabin. Lars returned on foot, leading the surviving horse, arriving home after dark to find Cyrus Halloway's wife sitting with Ingrid. She had come when she saw smoke from Lars's chimney stop rising, knowing something was wrong. Ingrid died on January 17th, 3 days after the cold snap began. They buried Ingrid on a hillside overlooking the creek where Lars had first brought her to see the land he had claimed. The ground was frozen solid to a depth of 2 feet. Lars and Cyrus Halloway spent 4 hours breaking through it with picks and iron bars, building a fire on the spot to thaw the earth enough to continue digging. The work was brutal, and the grave shallow, only 3 feet deep. But it was the best they could manage. Pastor Henrik Dalton traveled from the settlement that was forming 12 miles east to speak words over Ingrid's body. He was a Methodist circuit rider who covered a territory of 200 square miles, visiting scattered families and offering whatever spiritual comfort frontier life allowed. He had married Lars and Ingrid 2 years earlier and baptized Marta the following spring. 7 families attended the funeral, everyone who lived within a day's travel and could be notified in time. They stood in bitter cold while Pastor Dalton read from Scripture and spoke about Ingrid's kindness and her strength in facing frontier hardships. He did not mention that she had died from cold in her own home. He did not need to. Everyone present understood. After the burial, families returned to their cabins quickly. The temperature remained below zero, and standing outside for the funeral service had left everyone chilled through. Lars accepted brief condolences and then was alone with Marta, returning to a cabin that felt empty despite the child's presence. That night, sitting near the fireplace with Marta asleep on her pallet, Lars began thinking about how Ingrid had died. Not the medical details, though those haunted him, but the mechanical reality. She had frozen to death inside a cabin with a fire burning constantly. The cabin had failed to protect her. More specifically, the floor had killed her. He thought about how the cold had risen from beneath their bed, how moving the bed closer to the fireplace had not been enough, how the earth beneath the cabin had transmitted cold upward through the floor with relentless efficiency while the fire's heat escaped upward through the roof and was lost. The cabin was designed backwards. Heat went up and was wasted. Cold came up from below and could not be stopped. Over the following week, Lars spoke with other men who had lost family members to winter cold. Thomas Brennan had lost a son 4 years earlier during a similar cold snap. Ezra Phelps had lost his first wife in 1832. Owen Mercer's father had died from cold exposure while sleeping in a cabin, though that had been in the Dakotas years before. Each story followed the same pattern: extreme cold, inadequate heating, and floors that remained frozen despite fires burning constantly. The cabin design that everyone used, that had been used for generations on the American frontier, had a fundamental flaw. It could not keep the floor warm. Most men accepted this as unchangeable. Fire's nature was to rise. Earth's nature was to be cold in winter. You could not fight nature. Lars began to think differently. Spring came late in 1839. Snow remained on the ground until mid-April, and nighttime temperatures continued dropping below freezing into early May. Lars went through the motions of daily survival, caring for Marta, maintaining his trap lines, and processing the furs that would be his income when he traveled to St. Joseph to sell them. But his mind was elsewhere. He had become obsessed with floors, specifically with understanding why cabin floors stayed cold and whether anything could be done about it. The obsession was not abstract. Every time Marta walked across the cabin floor, she did so quickly, hopping from one foot to the other, trying to minimize contact with the cold surface. Every time Lars saw her do this, he thought about Ingrid. He began visiting neighboring cabins under various pretexts, bringing news or borrowed tools, anything that gave him reason to enter and observe. He paid attention to floor construction in ways that must have seemed strange to the families he visited. He would kneel and touch the floor, feeling its temperature. He would ask how the cabin had been built, what materials had been used beneath the floor, how deep the frost went in winter. Cyrus Halloway's cabin had a dirt floor like Lars's, packed clay over frozen earth. The floor stayed cold from October through April. Thomas Brennan had installed split log planks as flooring 2 years earlier, thinking wood would be warmer than dirt. The planks were indeed slightly warmer to the touch, but the difference was minimal. Cold still rose from the earth beneath, transmitted through the wood, making the floor uncomfortable throughout winter. Ezra Phelps had tried insulation. He had excavated beneath his cabin floor and filled the space with dry grass and pine needles before installing plank flooring over the top. The insulation had helped for 1 season, then compressed, and provided almost no benefit by the second winter. Every cabin Lars visited revealed the same fundamental problem. The earth beneath stayed frozen from November through March. That frozen earth was in direct contact with the floor, separated by, at most, a few inches of ineffective insulation. Heat from the fireplace rose upward and escaped through the roof. None of it reached the floor. Lars also paid attention to how cabins failed during extreme cold. He found an abandoned structure 5 miles north where a grizzly bear had broken through a wall during winter. The bear had targeted the corner farthest from where the fireplace had been, the coldest part of the structure, where frost buildup on the interior logs had weakened the chinking. Cold was not just uncomfortable. It was structurally damaging. It created weak points. It killed. And every cabin design Lars examined accepted cold floors as inevitable. He talked to older trappers and settlers, asking if anyone had ever solved the problem. No one had. Some mentioned that stone floors stayed slightly warmer than wood or dirt, but stone was difficult to work with and still transmitted cold from the earth beneath. Others suggested keeping fires burning larger and hotter, but that required enormous amounts of firewood and still did not warm the floor. By late May, Lars had reached a conclusion. The problem was solvable, but the solution would require thinking about cabin heating in a completely different way. Lars had dug a root cellar the previous autumn before Ingrid died. It was a simple structure located 30 feet from the cabin, excavated 6 feet deep into a hillside, and covered with logs and soil. The purpose was food storage, root vegetables, preserved meat, anything that needed to stay cool in summer and protected from freezing in winter. In early June, Lars went to the root cellar to retrieve potatoes he had stored the previous fall. He climbed down the short ladder into the underground space and immediately noticed something he had observed before but never considered significant. The temperature was comfortable, not warm, but noticeably warmer than the outside air. He had attributed this to shelter from wind, but standing in the cellar now, he realized that explanation was insufficient. Outside, the early June morning was cold, probably 40 degrees. Inside the root cellar, the temperature felt closer to 55 degrees. The difference was substantial. More importantly, Lars remembered checking the cellar during the worst of winter. Even when outside temperatures had been 30 below zero, the root cellar had never felt truly frigid. Cold, yes, but nothing like the brutal cold outside. He spent an hour in the cellar that morning, thinking. The structure was underground, surrounded by earth on 3 sides and covered with earth on top. The earth was insulating it, certainly, but something else was happening. The temperature in the cellar stayed relatively stable regardless of what was happening outside. It did not get as cold as the surface in winter. It did not get as warm as the surface in summer. Lars began to understand something about earth and temperature. The ground beneath the surface, below a certain depth, maintained a relatively constant temperature. In winter, when the surface froze solid, the earth 6 feet down stayed warmer, not hot, but stable, protected from the extremes happening above. He thought about his cabin floor. The frozen earth beneath it was surface earth, the top few feet that froze solid every winter. But what if you went deeper? What if you dug down to where the earth maintained stable temperature? And more importantly, what if you could somehow bring heat down to that level and store it there? The idea seemed backwards. Heat rose. Everyone knew that. You did not put heat underground. But Lars thought about blacksmiths and how they banked their forge fires. They buried hot coals under ash and sand at the end of the day. The mass of ash and sand held the heat. The coals stayed hot overnight, ready to be uncovered and brought back to flame the next morning. What if you could do the same thing under a cabin floor? What if you could create a mass of something that would absorb heat, hold it, and release it slowly? Not ash and coals, but something that would last indefinitely. Stone, perhaps, or metal. Something with weight and density that could soak up heat during the day when the fire was burning and release it at night when the fire died down. The concept was forming, still incomplete, but Lars felt the beginning of understanding. He needed to learn more about how heat moved and how materials held it. That knowledge would not be found in Montana territory. Lars left for St. Joseph in late June with a season's worth of beaver pelts loaded on 2 pack horses. Marta stayed with Cyrus Halloway's family, an arrangement that had become necessary since Ingrid's death. The journey would take 3 weeks each direction if weather cooperated and Lars avoided trouble with hostile tribes or bandits. St. Joseph, Missouri was the jumping-off point for Western migration, a rough town of permanent buildings mixed with temporary camps of people preparing to head to Oregon or California. It was also a market town where mountain men sold furs and bought supplies for another season in the wilderness. Lars had made the journey twice before and knew what to expect. He sold his furs to a buyer named Patterson, who operated out of a warehouse near the river. The price was fair, slightly better than the previous year, because beaver was recovering after several years of depressed demand. Lars walked away with $400 in silver coins, a substantial sum that he carefully divided between multiple hiding places in his gear. Most trappers would have spent the next week drinking and gambling before buying basic supplies and heading back to the mountains. Lars had different plans. He spent 2 days walking through St. Joseph, paying attention to buildings. The town had grown since his last visit. New construction was everywhere, including several buildings that interested Lars intensely. A hotel had been built with a heated floor in its main room. The heat came from a large brick stove in the basement, with the stove's heat rising through iron grates in the floor above. The floor was not dramatically warm, but it was noticeably warmer than the outside air, enough that guests commented on the comfort. Lars talked to the builder, a German immigrant named Kessler, who had built similar systems in Pennsylvania before coming west. Kessler explained the principle. Hot air rises, so you put the heat source below the space you want to warm. The warm air comes up through openings in the floor, simple physics. The challenge was building a safe system that would not fill the building with smoke or start a fire. Lars also visited a foundry where iron was being cast. He watched workers pour molten metal into molds and observed how the brick floor of the foundry stayed warm for hours after the furnaces were damped down. The bricks absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The workers told him the floor was easier to work on than a cold floor because it did not hurt your feet even in winter. He spent a day at a brick kiln outside town, watching how bricks were fired. The kiln was essentially a large stone chamber that was heated to extreme temperature and then allowed to cool slowly. The bricks inside absorbed heat evenly because they were surrounded by heat on all sides. The mass of bricks held temperature for days. Lars was learning about thermal mass, though he did not know the term. He was learning that heavy, dense materials absorbed heat and released it slowly. He was learning that heat could be stored and moved in predictable ways if you understood the principles. Lars spent his final 3 days in St. Joseph buying supplies that confused everyone who saw them. At Patterson's warehouse, he purchased a metal barrel, the kind used for storing salted pork or flour during long journeys. The barrel was cylindrical, 3 feet tall, and 2.5 feet in diameter, made of riveted iron with reinforcing bands. Patterson asked what Lars planned to store in it. Lars said he had not decided yet. The answer was obviously evasive, and Patterson looked at him like he was simple-minded, but accepted his money. At a hardware merchant, Lars bought tools, not the standard trapper's kit of knives and traps, but specialized items. A sharp mason's chisel, a small sledgehammer, a draw knife for shaping wood, 20 feet of heavy iron chain. The merchant asked if Lars was planning to build something. Lars said maybe. The merchant shrugged and took his money. The strangest purchase was river stones. Lars hired 2 boys to fill burlap sacks with smooth river stones from the bank of the Missouri, each stone roughly the size of a fist. He paid them to collect 200 pounds of stones and load them onto his pack horses. The boys thought he was insane. Stones were free anywhere. Why pay money to transport stones hundreds of miles into the mountains where stones were abundant? Lars could not explain without sounding crazy, so he did not try. He simply paid the boys and loaded his horses. His final purchase was tallow, 50 pounds of rendered animal fat, sold by a butcher. Tallow was used for making candles and waterproofing leather, but 50 pounds was an enormous quantity for one man. The butcher asked if Lars was planning to start a candle-making business. Lars said he needed it for a project. The butcher charged him twice the normal price, assuming Lars was desperate or stupid. When Lars left St. Joseph in mid-July, his pack horses were loaded with the strangest collection of supplies any trapper had carried into the mountains. Other trappers heading west looked at his gear and shook their heads. One man asked outright if Lars had lost his mind. Lars smiled and said perhaps he had. The return journey took 18 days. Lars pushed harder than usual, eager to get back to Marta and begin work on the idea that had been forming in his mind. When he arrived at Cyrus Halloway's cabin to retrieve his daughter, Halloway looked at the metal barrel tied to the pack horse and asked what Lars was planning. Lars said he was going to fix his cabin's floor. Halloway asked what was wrong with the floor. Lars said it was too cold. Halloway looked confused. Everyone's floor was cold. That was just how floors were. Lars did not argue. He thanked Halloway for watching Marta, loaded his daughter onto his horse, and rode home to begin work. Lars began digging on the first day of August, 1839. He moved Marta's sleeping pallet to one corner of the cabin and started excavating near the fireplace. marking out a rectangular area approximately 4 feet long and 3 feet wide. The location was deliberate. He wanted the pit directly adjacent to the stone fireplace base where heat would be most concentrated. The first foot of digging was easy. The packed clay floor broke apart with a shovel and pickaxe. Below that, the earth was harder, compressed by years of weight and moisture. Lars worked steadily, piling the excavated dirt outside the cabin. He dug from sunrise until the light failed, stopping only to prepare meals for Marta and maintain the basic necessities of living. Cyrus Halloway visited on the third day and stood in the doorway staring at the hole Lars had created. The pit was now 3 feet deep and growing. The cabin's interior looked destroyed. Dirt was everywhere. The floor torn up. Lars was filthy, covered in mud and sweat. Halloway asked what in God's name Lars was doing. Lars said he was improving his floor. Halloway said it looked like Lars was digging a grave inside his own house. Lars said it probably did look that way. Halloway asked if Lars had lost his mind after Ingrid's death. Lars said he did not think so, but he understood why it might appear that way. Halloway left shaking his head. By evening, word had spread through the scattered settlement. Lars Kendrick was digging up his cabin floor. The grief from losing his wife had finally broken something in his mind. People should check on him, make sure little Marta was being cared for properly. Thomas Brennan visited next, bringing Ezra Phelps with him. They found Lars 4 feet down in his excavation, the pit now large enough that he had to climb out using handholds carved into the earth walls. They asked direct questions. Was Lars all right? Did he need help? Was he planning to leave the area? Lars climbed out of the pit and explained what he was attempting. He was going to create a place under the floor where heat could be stored. He was going to fill a metal barrel with river stones and bury it in the pit. He was going to channel heat from the fireplace into the buried barrel. The stones would absorb heat during the day and release it upward through the floor at night. Brennan asked the obvious question. Heat rises. Everyone knows heat rises. How was Lars planning to make heat go down into a hole in the ground? Lars admitted he was not entirely certain of the mechanics, but he had seen brick floors stay warm in foundries. He had seen root cellars maintain stable temperatures. He understood that earth below the frost line stayed warmer than the surface. The principle was sound. Heat could be stored in mass and released slowly. Phelps said it sounded like a waste of time. Even if Lars could get heat into the buried barrel, it would just heat the dirt around it. None of it would come back up through the floor. Brennan agreed. The earth would absorb the heat, and Lars would have accomplished nothing except destroying his cabin floor. Lars had no answer that would satisfy them. He simply said he needed to try. By mid-August, the pit was complete. Lars had excavated to a depth of 5 feet, reaching earth that felt noticeably warmer than the surface soil. The pit's dimensions were precise, sized to accommodate the metal barrel with 2 feet of clearance on all sides. The bottom of the pit was level, carefully smoothed and packed firm. Lars began building the heat transfer system. Using flat stones he had collected from a nearby creek bed, he created a channel from the base of the fireplace to the edge of the pit. The channel was 6 inches wide and sloped gently downward. The concept was simple. Heat from the fireplace would travel along the stone channel into the pit. The engineering was crude but functional. Lars mortared the flat stones together using a mixture of clay and sand, creating a trough that would conduct heat. He extended the channel 18 inches into the pit, angling it to direct heat toward where the barrel would sit. The work took 4 days. Next came the barrel. Lars filled it with the river stones he had transported from St. Joseph, packing them tightly to eliminate air gaps. River stones were ideal because years of water erosion had made them smooth and dense. They would absorb heat efficiently and hold it for extended periods. The filled barrel weighed approximately 300 pounds. Getting it into the pit required help. Lars enlisted Owen Mercer, who lived 6 miles south and had not yet heard about the excavation project. Mercer was shocked when he saw what Lars had done to his cabin, but agreed to help lower the barrel. Using ropes and wooden poles as levers, they carefully lowered the stone-filled barrel to the bottom of the pit. Lars positioned the barrel to receive maximum heat from the stone channel. Then he began the backfilling process. He did not simply shovel dirt back into the pit. Instead, he packed the space around the barrel with specific materials in layers. First, a layer of sand went around the barrel's sides, packed tight to ensure good contact. The sand would conduct heat from the barrel outward into the surrounding earth. Next, Lars added a layer of the tallow he had purchased in St. Joseph. He melted it in his fireplace and poured it over the sand, creating a moisture barrier. The tallow soaked into the sand and hardened, creating a waterproof seal that would prevent groundwater from cooling the barrel. Over the tallow-soaked sand, Lars added dry soil mixed with small stones, tamping it down firmly. He filled the pit to within 1 foot of the original floor level, creating a solid mass around the buried barrel. The barrel was now encased in earth on all sides and bottom, with only the top exposed. The final step was creating the floor structure above the barrel. Lars built a framework of wooden joists that spanned the pit, resting on the undisturbed earth at the pit's edges. The joists were spaced to create an air gap of 10 inches between the top of the buried barrel and the underside of the floor. That would be installed above. This air gap was critical. Heat rising from the barrel would warm the air in this space, then heat the floorboards from beneath. September arrived with the first hints of autumn cold. Morning temperatures dropped into the 40s, and Lars knew he had limited time to complete the floor before serious cold made the work difficult. He began installing floorboards over the joist framework, working with the same obsessive attention to detail he had applied to every aspect of the project. The floorboards were split from pine logs Lars had felled and hewn during late summer. Each board was approximately 8 inches wide and 1 inch thick, shaped as uniformly as possible using his draw knife. He had learned in St. Joseph that uniform thickness was important for even heat distribution. Boards of varying thickness would create hot and cold spots on the floor's surface. Lars installed the boards with small gaps between them, approximately 1/4 inch. The gaps served 2 purposes. First, they allowed air circulation between the warm space beneath the floor and the cabin interior. Second, they provided room for the wood to expand and contract with temperature changes without buckling. The installation took 2 weeks. Lars worked methodically, fitting each board carefully and securing it with wooden pegs rather than nails. Pegs allowed for easier replacement if boards needed to be removed to access the barrel system below. He also created a removable section, a trapdoor of sorts, that would allow him to inspect the barrel and add or remove stones if needed. By late September, the floor was complete. The cabin's interior was transformed. Where there had been cold-packed clay, there was now smooth wooden planking. The visual improvement was significant, but Lars was not interested in appearance. He was interested in function. The first test came in early October when nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing. Lars built a fire in the fireplace, smaller than his usual winter fires, and let it burn through the evening. He fed the fire steadily but not excessively, using no more wood than he would normally burn on a cold autumn night. As the evening progressed, Lars paid attention to the floor. For the first hour, there was no noticeable change. The floor felt like any wooden floor, slightly warmer than dirt, but nothing remarkable. By the second hour, he noticed the floor near the fireplace felt warmer to the touch. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the floor near the walls. By the third hour, the warmth had spread. The section of floor directly over the buried barrel was warm enough that Lars could stand on it barefoot comfortably. He knelt and placed his palm flat against the boards. The surface temperature felt similar to sun-warmed wood in summer, not burning hot, but distinctly warm. Marta walked across the floor without hopping or rushing. She stood in one spot barefoot and smiled. "Papa, the floor does not, hurt my feet." Lars felt something release in his chest that had been tight since Ingrid died. He let the fire die down to coals around midnight and went to bed. In the morning, he woke before dawn and immediately checked the floor. The fire had been out for 5 hours. Outside, the temperature was 28 degrees. Inside the cabin, the floor over the barrel system was still warm to the touch. September arrived with the first hints of autumn cold. Morning temperatures dropped into the 40s, and Lars knew he had limited time to complete the floor before serious cold made the work difficult. He began installing floorboards over the joist framework, working with the same obsessive attention to detail he had applied to every aspect of the project. The floorboards were split from pine logs Lars had felled and hewn during late summer. Each board was approximately 8 inches wide and 1 inch thick, shaped as uniformly as possible using his draw knife. He installed the boards with small gaps between them, approximately 1/4 inch. The gaps allowed air circulation between the warm space beneath the floor and the cabin interior. The installation took 2 weeks. Lars worked methodically, fitting each board carefully and securing it with wooden pegs rather than nails. He also created a removable section, a trap door of sorts, that would allow him to inspect the barrel system below. By late September, the floor was complete. The cabin's interior was transformed. Where there had been cold-packed clay, there was now smooth wooden planking. But Lars was not interested in appearance. He was interested in function. The first test came in early October, when nighttime temperatures dropped below freezing. Lars built a fire in the fireplace, smaller than his usual winter fires, and let it burn through the evening. He fed the fire steadily, but not excessively, using no more wood than he would normally burn on a cold autumn night. As the evening progressed, Lars paid attention to the floor. For the first hour, there was no noticeable change. The floor felt like any wooden floor, slightly warmer than dirt, but nothing remarkable. By the second hour, he noticed the floor near the fireplace felt warmer to the touch. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the floor near the walls. By the third hour, the warmth had spread. The section of floor directly over the buried barrel was warm enough that Lars could stand on it barefoot comfortably. He knelt and placed his palm flat against the boards. The surface temperature felt similar to sun-warmed wood in summer, not burning hot, but distinctly warm. Marta walked across the floor without hopping or rushing. She stood in one spot, barefoot, and smiled. "Papa, the floor does not hurt my feet." Lars felt something release in his chest that had been tight since Ingrid died. He let the fire die down to coals around midnight and went to bed. In the morning, he woke before dawn and immediately checked the floor. The fire had been out for 5 hours. Outside, the temperature was 28 degrees. Inside the cabin, the floor over the barrel system was still warm to the touch. November brought steady cold and light snow. Lars continued his normal routines, trapping beaver along the creek and maintaining his small homestead. But every evening, he paid close attention to his floor's performance. The system was working better than his initial tests had suggested. As autumn progressed and temperatures dropped, the thermal mass system seemed to improve. The improvement made sense once Lars understood what was happening. The buried barrel and surrounding earth were reaching equilibrium. During the first weeks, heat from the fireplace had gone into warming the cold earth around the barrel. That earth had been frozen or near frozen for months and absorbed enormous amounts of heat before it warmed. But as the earth around the barrel stabilized at a higher temperature, less heat was lost to the surrounding soil. More heat stayed in the barrel system and radiated upward through the floor. By early December, Lars could maintain comfortable floor temperatures using less firewood than he had burned the previous winter. His evening fires were smaller, and he let them die down earlier. The barrel system held enough heat to keep the floor warm through the night. In the morning, the floor was still comfortable to walk on barefoot, even though the fire had been cold for 8 hours. Cyrus Halloway visited in mid-December and noticed immediately. He stepped inside the cabin and looked down at the floor. "You can walk on that barefoot?" Lars nodded. Halloway removed his boots and stood on the wooden planks. His expression changed from skepticism to confusion, to something like wonder. It is warm. How is it warm? Lars explained the system: the barrel buried beneath the floor, the river stones that absorbed heat, the air gap that allowed warmth to rise, the tallow barrier that prevented moisture from cooling the stones. Holloway listened, but clearly did not fully understand the mechanics. He simply knew that Lars's floor was warm and his own floor was miserably cold. Word spread, but not in the way Lars had hoped. People heard that Lars's floor was warm, but they attributed it to excessive wood burning. The common explanation that circulated through the settlement was that Lars was burning twice as much firewood as everyone else and wasting resources to heat his floor. The conclusion was that Lars was foolish and would run out of firewood before spring. Thomas Brennan repeated this theory to several families. He had not visited Lars's cabin since the excavation, so he had not seen the completed system or felt the warm floor himself. He simply assumed that warm floors required excessive fuel and that Lars was being impractical. Ezra Phelps was more direct in his criticism. He told Owen Mercer that Lars was burning through his woodpile at a reckless rate and would regret it when January cold arrived and he had no fuel left. Mercer asked if Phelps had actually seen how much wood Lars was using. Phelps admitted he had not, but insisted the math was simple. Warm floors required more fire. More fire required more wood. This didn't bother Lars. He knew his wood consumption was actually lower than the previous winter. His smaller, more efficient fires were adequate because the thermal mass system stored and distributed heat effectively. He did not need to convince anyone. Winter would do that for him. The blizzard arrived on January 9, 1840, announced by a peculiar yellow-gray sky that veteran frontiersmen recognized as a warning. Lars spent the afternoon of January 8th gathering firewood and securing his horses in their shelter. He brought extra hay inside the lean-to and made sure the structure was as weather-tight as possible. By sunset, the wind had picked up and the temperature was dropping fast. The storm hit after midnight. Lars woke to the sound of wind hammering against the cabin walls with a force that made the logs creak. Snow was falling so heavily that he could not see the horse shelter 30 feet away. The temperature had plunged to what Lars estimated was 20 below zero, possibly colder. For 3 days, the blizzard continued without pause. Wind drove snow through every tiny gap in the cabin's construction. Frost formed on the interior walls despite the fire burning constantly. The cold was the kind that killed people, the kind that froze exposed skin in minutes and made breathing painful. Lars maintained his fire carefully, feeding it regularly but not frantically. He burned less wood than he had during similar cold the previous winter. The barrel system beneath his floor was performing exactly as he had hoped. Heat from the day's fire soaked into the stone-filled barrel. At night, that stored heat radiated upward, keeping the floor warm even when the fire died to coals. Marta spent the 3 days playing on the warm floor, building small structures from wood scraps and telling elaborate stories to herself. She walked barefoot constantly, comfortable in a way that would have been impossible the previous winter. Lars watched her and thought about Ingrid, about how different that January would have been if this floor had existed a year earlier. On the 3rd day, the wind finally stopped. The temperature remained brutally cold, probably 30 below zero, but the snow had ceased and the sky was clearing. Lars bundled himself in furs and forced the cabin door open against the snowdrift that had piled against it. Snow had accumulated to a depth of 4 feet in some areas, sculpted by wind into strange formations. The landscape was transformed, beautiful and deadly. Lars checked his horses and found them alive, but stressed. He fed them from his hay supply and returned to the cabin. Inside, the floor remained warm. The fire had burned low while he was outside, but the thermal mass system continued radiating heat. The floor temperature had dropped slightly, but remained comfortable. Lars rebuilt the fire and prepared a meal. As he worked, he thought about his neighbors. Their cabins had the same walls, the same fireplaces, the same basic construction as his. But their floors would be frozen. Their families would be huddled near fires, unable to move far from the flames without experiencing punishing cold. Children would be confined to small warm zones, unable to play or move freely. His floor changed everything. It transformed the cabin from a barely adequate shelter into a genuinely comfortable home, even during the worst weather Montana could produce. The morning after the blizzard ended, Lars decided to check on his neighbors. The temperature remained dangerously cold, but the clear sky and calm wind made travel possible. He dressed in heavy furs, wrapped Marta in blankets, and trudged through waist-deep snow to Cyrus Halloway's cabin, a mile east. He found Halloway's family in desperate condition. Ice had formed on the interior walls in thick sheets. The cabin's single window was completely frosted over, blocking all light. The family was huddled within 5 feet of the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket and fur they owned. Halloway's 2 children, both younger than Marta, were shivering despite being pressed against their mother. Halloway looked exhausted. He had been feeding the fire constantly for 3 days, burning wood at an unsustainable rate just to keep the temperature near the fireplace barely tolerable. The floor was painfully cold. When Lars stepped inside, even wearing heavy boots, he could feel cold radiating upward through the soles. Halloway asked about Lars and Marta. Lars said they had weathered the storm comfortably. Halloway looked skeptical. Nobody was comfortable during that blizzard. Lars said his floor had stayed warm throughout. Halloway stared at him, then looked down at Lars's feet. "You are wearing boots. How would you know if the floor was warm?" Lars removed his boots. Then he removed his wool socks. Halloway's wife gasped. Standing barefoot on a cabin floor in this cold was insane. Lars stood calmly on Halloway's frozen floor for 10 seconds, long enough to demonstrate it was genuinely painful, then put his socks and boots back on. "That is how cold your floor is. Mine is warm enough to walk on barefoot comfortably. Marta does it constantly." Halloway did not believe him. Lars invited him to come see for himself. Halloway refused to leave his fire, so Lars departed, leaving Halloway confused and suspicious. From Halloway's cabin, Lars traveled to Thomas Brennan's place, 2 miles north. He found a similar scene. Brennan's family was crammed near their fireplace. Frost covered the walls. The floor was frozen solid. Brennan's 3 children were wrapped in blankets, their faces pale from days without adequate warmth. Brennan was more receptive than Halloway. He listened. When Lars described the thermal mass system, he asked questions about how the barrel was installed, how the heat transfer worked, whether the system required excessive wood. Lars answered honestly. The system used less wood than standard heating because stored heat continued warming the cabin after the fire died down. Brennan wanted to see it. Despite the cold, he dressed and accompanied Lars back to Lars's cabin. When they arrived, Brennan stepped inside and immediately noticed the difference. The air temperature was similar to his own cabin, but the floor radiated warmth. He removed his boots and stood on the wooden planks. His expression changed from skepticism to amazement. Brennan spent an hour examining the system. Lars showed him the removable floor section that allowed inspection of the buried barrel. He explained the stone channel that conducted heat from the fireplace. He described the layered backfill that insulated the barrel while allowing heat to radiate upward. Brennan asked if Lars would help him build a similar system. Lars said he would, come spring when the ground thawed enough to dig. Word of Brennan's visit spread quickly. Within a week, 3 other families had visited Lars's cabin to see the warm floor for themselves. The reaction was consistent. Initial skepticism dissolved when people removed their boots and felt the radiant warmth. Questions followed. How deep was the pit? How large was the barrel? What kind of stones worked best? How long did the floor stay warm after the fire died? Lars answered every question patiently. He was not trying to profit from his innovation or keep it secret. He simply wanted people to understand that cold floors were not inevitable. The problem could be solved with labor and planning. Owen Mercer arrived on a February afternoon carrying his youngest son. The boy, 3 years old, was wrapped in blankets but shivering. Mercer's face was tight with worry. He asked if Lars could help. His son had developed frostbite on both feet from sleeping on the cabin's frozen floor. The damage was not severe yet, but Mercer feared it would worsen if the cold continued. Lars brought Mercer inside and had him unwrap the boy near the fireplace. The child's feet were pale, and the toes showed early signs of frostbite. Not bad enough to cause permanent damage yet, but clearly painful. Lars suggested Mercer keep the boy off cold surfaces entirely until the feet healed. Mercer said that was impossible. His entire cabin floor was frozen. The boy would have to touch it eventually. Lars offered an immediate solution. Mercer and his son could stay in Lars's cabin until the feet healed. Mercer refused charity, but Lars insisted it was not charity, it was practical. The boy needed a warm floor to recover. Lars had a warm floor. The solution was obvious. Mercer stayed for 3 days. His son spent the time walking barefoot on Lars's warm floor, and the frostbite began to improve. Mercer watched the boy play comfortably and made a decision. When he returned home, he began planning to rebuild his cabin floor using Lars's method. But Mercer's cabin was 6 miles from Lars's location, too far for regular consultation during construction. Mercer asked if Lars would come stay at his place for a few weeks in spring to supervise the work. He offered to pay in furs or labor. Lars agreed, but refused payment. Helping Mercer meant one less family suffering through cold floors. That was payment enough. By late February, 5 families had committed to rebuilding their cabin floors using thermal mass systems. None of them called it Lars's invention or gave him credit. They simply referred to it as the warm floor method or the buried barrel technique. Lars did not care about credit. He cared about Marta walking barefoot comfortably and about other children not suffering the cold that had killed Ingrid. The innovation was spreading not through formal teaching or documentation, but through direct experience. People felt the warm floor, understood it was possible, and decided to replicate it. That was enough. Spring arrived in late March of 1840, bringing thawing ground and the possibility of construction. Lars kept his promise to Owen Mercer and traveled to Mercer's cabin in early April with tools and a clear plan. Mercer had already acquired a metal barrel and collected river stones during the winter months. The preparation impressed Lars. Mercer had been planning carefully. The excavation took a week. Mercer's cabin had a plank floor that needed to be removed before digging could begin. The work was harder than Lars's original project because they had to preserve the cabin's livability while tearing up the floor. They worked in sections, completing one area before moving to the next, so Mercer's family always had usable floor space. Lars supervised, but let Mercer do most of the physical work. This was intentional. Mercer needed to understand the system completely so he could maintain it and potentially help others build their own. Lars explained the reasoning behind each decision, why the pit needed to be 5 feet deep, why the barrel should be positioned near the fireplace, why the air gap between barrel and floor mattered. Thomas Brennan visited during the second week and watched the construction process. He asked detailed questions about the stone channel design and the layered backfill technique. Lars showed him how to create the heat transfer pathway and explained why tallow worked better than clay alone for waterproofing. By the end of April, Mercer's floor was complete. The system functioned well from the first fire test. Mercer's family walked barefoot on warm floors for the first time in their lives. His youngest son, whose frostbitten feet had motivated the project, spent entire days playing on the floor without discomfort. Word continued spreading. Ezra Phelps, who had been among the most vocal skeptics, visited Mercer's cabin in May. He felt the warm floor and asked Mercer how much the construction had cost. Mercer listed the expenses: 1 metal barrel, tools Lars had loaned him, tallow for waterproofing, and 3 weeks of hard labor. No cash had changed hands. Everything was traded or borrowed. Phelps admitted he had been wrong to dismiss the idea. He asked if Lars would help him build a similar system, agreed but said he needed to return to his own cabin for the summer trapping season. He could help Phelps in the fall. By summer, 5 cabins in the scattered settlement had warm floor systems. None were identical. Each builder adapted the basic concept to their specific circumstances. Some used different barrel sizes. Others positioned the heat channels differently. A few experimented with alternative thermal mass materials, trying sand or gravel instead of river stones. The variations did not trouble Lars. The core principle remained consistent. Bury thermal mass beneath the floor. Channel heat to it from the fireplace. Allow stored heat to radiate upward. The specific implementation details could vary based on available materials and individual circumstances. The technique was spreading organically, person to person, cabin to cabin. No one called it by Lars's name. It was simply becoming the accepted method for anyone who wanted a warm floor. Winter of 1840 to 41 arrived early. Snow fell in late October, and temperatures dropped below freezing by early November. The families with thermal mass floor systems prepared for cold weather, with confidence they had never felt before. Those still using traditional cabin construction prepared with dread. Pastor Henrik Dalton made his circuit through the settlement in December, visiting families and documenting their conditions. He had been traveling this route for 6 years and had witnessed multiple deaths from cold exposure during harsh winters. This winter, he noticed something different. The families with warm floors were healthier, more comfortable, and using less firewood than previous years. Dalton kept careful records. He noted which families had adopted the new floor system and which had not. He documented illnesses, cold-related injuries, and deaths. His records would later prove valuable in understanding the innovation's impact. January brought severe cold, though not as extreme as the previous year's blizzard. Temperatures remained below zero for 2 weeks straight. This was the test. Could the thermal mass systems handle sustained extreme cold, or would they fail when stressed? Lars's floor performed flawlessly. He maintained moderate fires, and the floor stayed consistently warm. His wood consumption was half what it had been 2 years earlier during similar cold. The efficiency came from heat storage. Every bit of warmth generated during the day was captured in the barrel system and released slowly overnight instead of escaping through the roof. Cyrus Halloway, who had mocked Lars's excavation project 18 months earlier, suffered through the January cold, with his family crowded near their fireplace. His children developed chilblains from repeated exposure to the frozen floor. His wife begged him to ask Lars for help building a warm floor system. Halloway's pride prevented him from asking directly, but he mentioned to Thomas Brennan that he might consider improving his floor. Brennan, who now had a functioning thermal mass system, offered to help Halloway build one come spring. No mention of Lars was necessary. The knowledge had spread beyond its originator. By February, the pattern was clear. Families with warm floors were surviving winter with minimal suffering. Families with traditional floors were enduring the same misery they had always endured, but now they knew an alternative existed. Pastor Dalton's records from that winter documented 0 cold-related deaths among families with thermal mass floor systems. 3 deaths occurred in families still using traditional construction. 2 were elderly individuals who might have died regardless, but one was a child who developed pneumonia after prolonged exposure to cold floors. The child's death could likely have been prevented if the family had adopted the warm floor method. Dalton did not publish his findings, but he shared them quietly with families during his visits. The evidence was clear. Warm floors saved lives. The innovation that settlers had mocked 18 months earlier as Lars's madness was now recognized as a genuine advancement in frontier survival. Lars remarried in the spring of 1843. Her name was Catherine Brennan, Thomas Brennan's widowed sister, who had come west after her husband died in Ohio. She was practical, kind, and accepted Lars and Marta without reservation, bringing stability that had been missing since Ingrid's death. The marriage was quiet, performed by Pastor Dalton in Lars's cabin. Catherine walked barefoot on the warm floor during the ceremony and smiled. She had heard about Lars's innovation and considered it evidence of intelligence rather than eccentricity. By 1845, Lars was ready to leave Montana Territory. The beaver population had collapsed and the fur trade was dying. He wanted Marta to have access to education. They decided to move to Oregon Territory where land was available and communities were forming. Lars sold his cabin to a young trapper named James Cutler, who had specifically sought it out because of the warm floor. Cutler promised to maintain the system and share the knowledge with others. The journey to Oregon took 2 months. Lars, Catherine, Marta, and Catherine's daughter settled in the Willamette Valley near Salem. Lars built a house with a basement heating system inspired by his thermal mass design. He lived quietly as a farmer and occasional carpenter, teaching his sons the principles of heat distribution. He never spoke publicly about his cabin innovation. Meanwhile, in Montana and throughout the northern Rockies, the warm floor technique continued spreading. Homesteaders arriving in the 1850s discovered abandoned cabins with barrel systems beneath the floors. Some understood immediately. Others asked local old-timers, who explained the floor furnace method. By the 1860s, variations of the technique were common enough that builders incorporated thermal mass principles into frontier construction without knowing the origin. Underground heating was simply something people did in cold climates. Lars Kendrick died in 1867 at age 62. He was buried in a cemetery outside Salem. His gravestone listed his name, birth and death years, and identified him as a loving husband and father. No mention was made of Montana, wrapping, or heating systems. In Montana, cabins built using Lars's method remained functional into the 1880s. The barrel systems continued working decades after installation, requiring minimal maintenance. The innovation's legacy was measured not in recognition, but in lives saved and comfort provided. Dozens of families survived brutal winters because someone had proven that cold floors were not inevitable. Children grew up healthy because they did not spend months walking on frozen surfaces. The technique saved firewood, reduced suffering, and demonstrated that frontier problems could be solved through careful thought. Lars never received credit during his lifetime and would not have wanted it. He had built the system to save his daughter from the cold that killed her mother. Everything else was simply a consequence of solving that one personal problem effectively. The quiet legacy suited him. Innovation measured not in glory claimed, but in warmth provided year after year, cabin after cabin, across the frozen frontier.